The courtroom fell quiet like the moment before a rainstorm. "Let my mother go, and I will make the judge step down," said Malik Johnson, his voice small but sharp enough to cut through the legal murmurs, a promise that sounded impossible and left the room stunned. The air smelled of old paper and coffee. A fluorescent light hummed overhead. Polished wood reflected the faces of strangers. The judge, Harold Kane, set his gavel down and blinked as if the words had been aimed directly at him. The gallery tightened, a rustle of jackets and a cough, as if the building itself were deciding whether to laugh. Malik was 13, his school shirt still wrinkled from the morning, his hands on the edge of the defense table like someone holding on to the last rung of a ladder. His mother, Denise Johnson, sat with her shoulders rounded under the weight of an accusation that had turned her into a scapegoat at St. Luke Community Hospital. The prosecutor, Lisa Benton, smiled in that way people smile when a story is already written and the ending is known. "Where is your proof, boy?" she said, the word boy dropping like a stone. Malik did not flinch. "I have a recording," he answered, and a tiny digital player inside his backpack sat warm against his ribs as if it knew the moment it would matter. "If you are here for a story about courage and truth, stay with us, because this is where a room full of confident adults first underestimated a child and then had to answer to the authority of evidence. How does a laughingstock become a legend? How does a single recording create a chain of custody that unravels institutional arrogance?" The question hung in the air like smoke. The status quo in that county courtroom had been predictable for years. St. Luke Community Hospital was a modest institution in a city of frayed hopes where staff worked double shifts and paperwork multiplied like weeds. The hospital administration kept its records in binders, the board held closed meetings, and a culture of deference settled in like dust. Judge Harold Kane had been a fixture for 2 decades, known for swift decisions and a courtroom rhythm that left little room for sympathy. Prosecutor Lisa Benton had a reputation for tenacity. Defense attorney Marcus Reed had a reputation for grit. The local press often turned toward stories that confirmed what people already believed. In the back row, reporter Naomi Cruz took notes, her pen scratching like a metronome. Court clerk Aaron Mills shuffled papers with ink on his fingers. The system was a machine built of routine documents, registry stamps, carpetory copies of records, and a sense that authority was not to be questioned. During preliminary hearings, it was common to see nurses and aides condemned on what looked like evidence on paper but felt like prejudice in practice. The gallery reacted with polite indignation when Denise's arrest was announced, some patrons, others whispering details they had heard in the hallway. Coach Thomas Davis from Malik's middle school and Principal Sarah Monroe sat together, faces drained of color because they knew the family beyond the case files. The tone was set before any proof came forward. An accusation became the narrative, and the accused became a character already cast. The accusation against Denise was simple on its face and devastating in its consequences. She was charged with diverting narcotics from the emergency ward, a crime that would end her career and put her in a custody dispute with a legal system unsympathetic to single mothers. The hospital filed a complaint after a routine inventory showed missing doses of a controlled medication. A nurse named Brenda Cole gave a deposition saying she had seen Denise near the supply room. The inventory sheets, initialed by the charge nurse, looked clinical and final. "We followed procedure," said hospital administrator Samuel Gray in a clipped tone during intake, his tie tight around a neck that never seemed to sweat. Evidence on a table included a sign-out sheet with Denise's scribble, a CCTV excerpt with pixelated frames and no audio, and the written testimony of a doctor who could not recall exact times. In the gallery, whispers rose and fell like tide. "Did you see the inventory report?" someone asked. "It is clear on paper," said a woman near the back, and the sound of certainty spread. But paper can be persuasive and wrong at the same time. The defense cross-examined the witnesses, but the prosecutor had crafted a neat story: motive, opportunity, and a signature on a log. The court clerk stamped each exhibit with a gaze that made them feel official, and the audience accepted the display. Yet no one asked a crucial question aloud. What if someone had manufactured the evidence? What if the recording that Malik claimed to have was the missing piece that exposed more than one guilty person? Malik's determination was not sudden. He had been watching patterns since he was 8, a child of long hospital shifts and whispered grievances. The backstory of Malik Johnson unfolded in the small details. He had been born in a neighborhood where lights winked out early, where the corner grocery doubled as a confessional for lives on thin margins. He learned to count change for his mother, to listen for the rhythm of exhaust and ambulance sirens, to read faces that hid fatigue. At 10, he began marking his mother's shift changes on a worn calendar, learning names of supervisors and where certain doors opened. School gave him a bookish calm. He loved math and the logic that made sense when people did not. At home, there were nights when Denise came in smelling of disinfectant and fried food from a late-shift diner, her hands trembling as she counted pills. He asked questions, and she answered until she could not. At 12, he hid a small recorder in his backpack. After Denise came home talking about a missing bottle and a supervisor who had suggested they would look bad if a stock discrepancy remained unexplored. He was not a sleuth by training, but by necessity. His keen observation formed a map of routines: who arrived late, who left early, who logged entries in a particular scrawl. This backstory mattered because it explained why a child who loved puzzles could see discrepancies adults missed. He was not motivated by glory. He wanted his mother back at her bedside, wanted the routine of dinner together, homework on the kitchen table, and the hum of the television on low in nights that suddenly felt louder without her. These memories gave him armor and focus. He knew the hospital scent, the metallic tang of the supply room, the texture of the logbook, and the cadence of staff voices. He had watched the way authority spoke softly to those it favored and sharply to those it did not, and he decided he would not let a paper trail write his family's ending. He reached out to Marcus Reed, an experienced defense attorney known for taking cases when others would not, and to Naomi Cruz, the reporter who had a small podcast and a curious audience. Their first meeting smelled of stale coffee and urgency. "You sure about this?" Marcus asked, flipping through Malik's handwritten notes. "We can move carefully, but we need the recording in court with a verified chain of custody." "I recorded more than I thought," Malik said, fingers clenched, "but I need help to prove it is real." Naomi leaned forward, eyes bright. "If we can get a forensic analysis, we can show when and where and whether the file has been edited." Marcus nodded. "We will need an expert to testify about the recording and the registry entries. We will also need to protect custody of the file so no one can claim tampering." He added, "We must prepare for authority to push back. They will defend themselves." Dr. Helen Park, a forensic audio analyst, agreed to a quiet meeting at a cafe where the smell of espresso cut the talk. "I will examine the metadata, look for waveforms that show room acoustics and human voices, and compare timestamps," she said, tapping a tablet. Her credentials mattered because institutional responses respect technique as much as testimony. Aaron Mills, the clerk, file-stanced a chain of custody form when Marcus filed a motion to admit electronic evidence. Coach Thomas Davis and Principal Sarah Monroe provided character letters that described Denise as a pillar of the school community. Each ally filled a role: Naomi for public pressure, Marcus for courtroom strategy, Dr. Park for technical authority, and the letters for humanizing the accused. The partial revelation came in a cramped hallway outside the courtroom where Malik handed Naomi a phone and swallowed. "Listen to this part," he said softly. The file carried the hum of fluorescent lights and a voice that matched the... Naomi's breath hitched as she heard a phrase that was not in the official record. They published a short excerpt on Naomi's podcast that evening, and overnight the story spread. A damaging phrase caught on tape that suggested motive and instruction rather than error. Comments flooded in. The prosecution called it edited. The hospital issued a terse statement defending its integrity. Marcus filed for forensic sequestration and an evidentiary hearing. "If this tape is authentic, we have an institutional problem," said Dr. Park during a recorded interview, and she explained in clear terms textbooks rarely did. A forensic analysis examines waveforms, metadata, background noise signatures, and device fingerprints. Her short explanation in court of 300 characters described how she would verify the recording by matching timestamps, checking sampling rates, and confirming the chain of custody to exclude post-recording edits. The explanation made the technical accessible and set the stage for a procedural clash. The gallery buzzed with the new energy of a public that sensed a challenge to authority. This was the moment when a boy's secret recording stopped being a rumor and started being evidence that demanded institutional response. At the evidentiary hearing, the dialogue expanded into a dozen pointed exchanges that revealed posture and intent. "Where did you get this file?" Prosecutor Lisa Benton asked, voice tight. "I recorded it at work," Malik answered, palms sweaty but voice steady. "Were you present when Denise signed the log?" she pressed. "Yes," he said. "Did you move the device?" "No," Malik replied. Marcus leaned in. "Dr. Park, could you tell the court how you verified the file?" "I examined the file's header and metadata, compared ambient signatures to the hospital's audio profile, and ran an authentication routine," she said. "The voice prints match Samuel Gray," Naomi interjected, reading back the transcript she had prepared. "This sounds like coaching," Gray's attorney claimed. "We will contest the chain of custody," said Gray directly with a practiced calm. Aaron Mills, the court clerk, testified about the registry entries and how exhibits are sealed in the clerk's office. "I logged Exhibit D with the digital storage number and timestamp," he said, sliding a paper across the bench. The back and forth went on, each reply sharpening the stakes. The gallery leaned forward in unison as the courtroom transformed into a stage where technical terms met human consequences. For the first time, authority had to respond in detail to evidence rather than rely on its assumed right to be believed. 3 moments of tension unfolded with palpable intensity, each demanding choices that revealed character. The first came when Denise was called to the stand, and the prosecutor pressed her about missing doses. The courtroom smelled of antiseptic and perfume, and Denise's hands trembled on the microphone. Memories flooded Malik like cold water. He saw his mother's laugh at home, her tucked apron, the nights she could not sleep. "Did you take the medications?" the prosecutor asked. Denise took a... "No," she said. But her eyes darted to Malik and then to Marcus, and the judge's silence felt like a verdict in itself. This internal conflict forced her to decide whether to speak purely from fear or from the truth she carried inside. The second moment came when the forensic expert played the recording and the administrator's voice suggested a plan to alter logs. The gallery gasped, a wet sound of disbelief, and the prosecutor's face changed from confident to defensive. Malik remembered the exact clank of the supply room door and how the tape captured it like a signature. The public reaction pulled at his resolve. The third moment of tension arrived when Judge Kane, cornered by proof, had to rule on a motion to suspend him pending investigation. He looked around the room, the weight of position heavy in his posture. Memories of his tenure and the respect he had commanded fought against the prospect of a fall from grace. Each moment lasted in slow motion, and each forced decisions that would echo beyond the moment. The courtroom drama moved toward a public climax when the recording was played in full before the assembled press and citizens. Naomi streamed a live segment, the sound carrying with clarity that left no room for dismissal. Voices in the recording matched the hospital administrator and a supervisor in ways that suggested orchestration. The prosecutor attempted to cast doubt, raising procedural questions about admissibility and pointing to gaps in custody forms. But Dr. Park testified methodically, explaining in simple terms the science of audio authentication. "The waveform contains background acoustics unique to that hallway," she said. "There are no edits detected, and the sampling integrity is intact." The gallery's murmurs swelled into loud exclamations as people heard an authority figure speaking about manipulating registry entries. Coach Thomas Davis slapped a hand to his mouth. Principal Sarah Moreau stood, eyes wide. The judge's face reddened. Under the pressure of public attention and verified evidence, the hospital announced an internal suspension of the administrator, and the attorney for Samuel Gray left the bench in a flurry of cufflinks and whispered directives. The moment felt like the slow unspooling of a held breath. "You exposed them," Naomi said to Malik in a quiet interview afterward, her voice carrying both admiration and disbelief. "We did what we had to do," Malik answered, but his voice carried the fatigue of a boy who had grown up too fast. Immediate consequences followed within days. The county authority announced an independent investigation into alleged abuse of power at St. Luke's, citing the recording and the forensic report. Samuel Gray was placed on administrative leave, and prosecutor Lisa Benton requested a review of her office's handling of hospital complaints. A federal watchdog opened a preliminary inquiry into procedural irregularities, citing chain of custody concerns and potential tampering with registry logs. The hospital's board convened an emergency session. Naomi's report led to national coverage and opinion pieces that demanded accountability and reparations for those wronged. Marcus filed motions to dismiss charges against Denise and to seal certain institutional documents pending review. The community reacted with protests outside the hospital and the courthouse, with banners calling for integrity and justice. Coach Thomas organized a fundraiser for the family that raised modest sums but considerable support. Aaron Mills, who had logged evidence, found himself under scrutiny and offered testimony that would become important in later stages. The atmosphere was a mixture of vindication and turmoil. For Malik and his family, the victory was not yet complete. The legal machinery spun on, and the strain of public attention weighed on nights that were once private. 1 month after the courtroom revelation, things had changed but not settled. Denise was released on her own recognizance and returned to a home where the aroma of home-cooked food reassured small domestic rituals. The hospital had installed a temporary oversight committee and initiated a review of procurement protocols. Naomi's series of reports prompted a television network to produce an investigative segment highlighting procedural failures and the importance of chain of custody in modern cases. Marcus was drafting motions that would seek formal apologies and financial reparations for Denise. Malik received invitations to speak at a community event and felt awkward under applause he never wanted. The city council introduced a motion for mandatory training at healthcare institutions about inventory controls and whistleblower protections, led by Councilwoman Elena Ruiz, whose support had been vocal early in the scandal. The public praised the courage of a child who refused to be invisible, and yet private costs were high. Malicious messages arrived, and Denise slept fitfully. Supporters organized meal trains and legal fundraisers. The small returns of normal life were tentative but real. 3 months later, a special oversight board released a preliminary report noting systemic issues, recommending disciplinary proceedings against several administrators, and requesting federal audit. The prosecutor's office reviewed internal procedures, and a few staff received reprimands for procedural lapses. Naomi's podcast had grown its audience substantially, and she published full transcripts and source documents online for transparency. Marcus filed a civil suit seeking reparatory damages for Denise and others affected. School officials invited Malik to speak about civic duty and the importance of observation, and he gave a halting speech that moved some to tears.
The court records showed motions filed against those who had attempted to obfuscate the trails of evidence, and an ethics committee opened an inquiry into the conduct of certain staff. Public debate shifted from a single accusation to broader questions about authority and accountability in institutions that serve vulnerable populations. The conversation was less about scandal and more about structural repair. 6 months later, the landscape had transformed in ways that felt both tangible and fragile. An official settlement included financial compensation and a formal apology from St. Luke Community Hospital to Denise and others impacted. Samuel Gray had resigned and faced an internal investigation that could lead to professional sanctions.
Judge Harold Kane was subject to review by a Judicial Oversight Council, and a committee recommended mandatory transparency measures for registry checks and an audit trail for controlled substances. The county launched a training program on chain of custody and integrity for hospital staff across the region. Malik became a minor public figure who lectured in schools about civic responsibility, voice, and vigilance, always careful to say he did not seek fame but justice. Naomi investigations continued, and she received an award for investigative journalism. Dr. Helen Park testified at a symposium on forensic science and the role of technology in protecting due process. The changes did not erase the nights Denise had lost or the humiliation she had suffered, but they erected safeguards that would make the same harm less likely to be repeated. The city now had clearer protocols. A citizen watchdog group had formed, and a small statue in the community center honored those who had spoken truth to power. If this story moved you, join the conversation in the comments below. Start your reply with "I saw" and share in one line whether you have ever witnessed an institutional failure or a moment where a small voice made a big difference. Your brief testimony helps others see they are not alone, and it guides future investigations we may pursue. We read every comment to learn, to connect victims with resources, and to find other threads that point to patterns. If you know someone who has documents, recordings, or recollections that matter, say so briefly, and we will follow up when ethical and safe. This community grows stronger when it listens and acts. But what happened next is even more important. Stay with the narrative as it moves from revelation to reform and to the people whose lives were reshaped. Months later, the legacy was not only legal. The phrase that once made Malik a laughingstock became a lesson in institutional humility. The city adopted new policies that emphasized integrity over appearances, and a small foundation was set up to support families caught in similar legal entanglements. Public officials named Elena Ruiz, Naomi Cruz, Marcus Reed, Dr. Helen Park, Aaron Mills, and Coach Thomas Davis as part of a civic advisory board to ensure future transparency. The files were preserved, the chain of custody upheld, and the court of public opinion had forced institutions to re-examine practices long defended by custom. For the Johnson family, the reparations brought practical relief. Denise returned to nursing with restored credentials and a cautious new position in a clinic with better oversight. Malik finished his school year, his backpack heavier with books than secrets, and he spoke at assemblies about paying attention to small details. The final lesson was both simple and profound. Authority can be challenged with integrity, and an accusation is not the end of a story unless people allow it to be. If this story inspired you, subscribe to follow cases where ordinary people hold institutions to account. Remember that courage sometimes comes in small voices, and that truth often travels on a single recording.